think you have a tendency when things doesn't go well, you blame yourself. But anyway, I started writing long time ago, and then actually one of my friends, who translated it into English, said, you should write a book. Because, I mean, she was a little special, and as you say, today she would have had the diagnosis Asperger, but light Asperger. I mean, she wasn't very, she wasn't very special, but she was a little special, yes. The kindergarten she was in, they wanted to have meetings in the morning, and I mean, she was 2 years old, she was absolutely the youngest. And they should sit at the meetings talking about how the day, who should do this during the day, who should do that. Because she didn't really sort of function in this kindergarten so well with those meetings in the morning where you should plan the day and the jobs you should do during the day. Then she was sent to a psychologist. Then she came to fritidshjem, and then there they also thought she was a bit special, and then they also sent her to a psychologist, which was in the university. They described her very sort of perfectly well. I mean, she was in some ways very social, but it's like she was playing next to the others. She was a part of the game, but still she was sort of a little outside. But she was functioning all right, and she was happy enough. But when they talked to her, then it's like she didn't understand what they were saying. And that's why they thought that it may be a good idea to put her to the clinic for see if there was something wrong in her brain. Well, then she came to the clinic for neurology, and they found out, well, it could be epilepsy. I guess that was a very new sort that children had epilepsy at that time. So they started giving her medication, and that was Depakote. And then everything started getting wrong. Anyway, she was supposed, because she was only 11 years old, so she was supposed to be in a psychiatric ward. I mean, because it was very dangerous to give that medication to a small 11-year-old girl. And they kept on giving her more and more because it didn't get better. I mean, I would say she got worse and worse. But anyway, they gave her more and more, and at last she had a huge amount, and she almost died. I mean, she suddenly laid in the bed and couldn't feel her arms, she couldn't feel her legs, she couldn't feel anything. So I called immediately, she was home at that time, I called immediately the neurologist and said, something is really wrong, and said, well, she is about to get a dangerous attack, stop giving the medication. But then everything went wrong. I don't know, maybe the neurologist can't remember what she wrote in the file, I don't know. Anyway, what is written in the file is so different what was taking place. Anyway, what was written in the file was everything about how bad Luise was functioning, how much better she got from the medication, and how the mother was opposing the treatment. They made an application so she could come for a special home for people who were very difficult, like Luise was. Oh my God. And I could feel, of course I didn't want that case, but they all said you have to follow the rules, otherwise they would just take her away from you completely. They could do that when you oppose the treatment. That's like in America and everywhere else, but it actually did start already in the 80s in Denmark. Yeah. Then she was out of the system for many years, and she stopped having this medication, and because, yeah, that was a horrible incident. She tried to take her life because she couldn't really bear what was going on in her brain. And she did it so well, so she almost succeeded. I got her to hospital, and the first she said when she was waking up from that very heavy medication she had taken herself was, I can't live with my brain, it is working so wrongly. Yeah. And then they wanted to put her in a psychiatric ward, and I say, no, 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 for God's sake, not again. That's where it started. And actually this neurologist, she said, okay, she goes home better, and you could read in the file that now she is much better than she was a year ago when she was on the medication. Then if you go a little back in the file, you could read on the medication she was so much better than without medication. So it's sometimes a bit hard to believe in the doctors, the specialists it is, Anyway, then she was out of medication for 4 years, and then she became 18, and now she had to sort of, she didn't have any education, and she hadn't had a very good life, so she needed some help. To get an education. And then she had to have a diagnosis to get the help. So we went to a psychiatric ward just to have this diagnosis, It was in 1992. It was a very good conversation with a psychiatrist, and she said she could see Luise was more or less okay, but of course she needed some help. And of course it should be without medication, of course it should, otherwise you couldn't find out what help a person needs. Luise said, well, I don't want any medication. I once had medication towards epilepsy and I got so ill and aggressive from it. So I don't want any medication. And of course the psychiatrist said, no, of course you shouldn't have. But then I heard the psychiatrist talk on her. I called her that what should be done, and that was no medication and trying to find out what kind of help she needed. And the next day I came to see Luise. She was just, horrible. She was lying on the floor, couldn't get up. She had, I don't know if you should say she had peed, and she couldn't get up. And I ran out, I got a shock, and I ran out and said to the person, Luise is lying on the floor, she can't get up. She has, what has happened? It was like they wouldn't talk to me and say, oh, well, she can't get up, she keeps on falling, it's just to get attention. Well, she couldn't get up. I helped her up. She got into bed, and she was, of course, very angry at me and said, well, you have to get me out of this. It's because of medication I can't stand on my feet. I said, oh yes, of course. I said, it wasn't a part of the deal or what you could say. You should not have any medication. And I tried to get hold of the psychiatrist from last night. She was even on the ward, but she wouldn't talk to me. She said, well, I'm very busy. Come on later. And I never got in contact with her. She always had a good excuse. She wouldn't talk to me. And then after 8 days, Luise had this malignant neuroleptica syndrome. Where she almost died. And she was put into hospital very, very quickly. Blew all over, the body. And she was very, very ill. Almost died. She didn't die. But afterward, it was like her brain was, I don't know. It was like I was in a shock myself. Anyway, I know I got a conversation with the chief psychiatrist. But I later found out that was just because they wanted to, put me somewhere so I wouldn't make a complaint, actually. Because I can see that this conversation is put in a date where I wasn't, and we talked about something we didn't talk about. They just wanted to make the file look as if I had been sort of agreeing on the medication all the time. They were simply lying, I'm sad to say. I'm ashamed to say, actually, because very strange. Many years after, to read about the conversation. I know all that happened because, I was writing down, and I know I wasn't at a meeting that day. I wasn't even in Copenhagen that day. I could see that in my calendar. Everything was written was wrong. When I talked to the psychiatrist and said, I can't understand why she is so tired and why she is so slow, and I can't sort of recognize my daughter at all. And then I said, well, she doesn't get very much medication. It's just because her illness has developed. they said. I was so much in shock. I guess I believed in it. Anyway, I had to believe in it. I couldn't take her home at that time because he was so ill. I mean, I could not at all. Then I should stop living. I mean, stop working, stop living. And no, I couldn't have done it. After writing the book, I must admit, I don't know how many contacted me and said, how good you have explained what is going on. It could have been my story or my friend's story, or I know somebody who read the book who said, well, that could have been my story. And it happens all the time, and that is what is so horrible about it. I don't know what to do. And still, people do believe that they can get help in psychiatry, and I'm sure some do, but very many are made lifelong psychiatric victims, yes. And that's what is so horrible about it. It's a long story, but I will first describe the 3 years where she was in St. Hans, where she was, I mean, changing ward all the time. It's also dependent on which psychiatrist you get, because in some wards she was just about to get discharged because now she was fine. And then she came to a new ward where she was suddenly put in belt because I thought she was very, very ill and her medication was sort of put up, and yeah. I mean, the first 2 years she was about to get discharged all the time. The third year, it was like she was stuck. They had forgotten all about discharging her. And then they found out that it was a good idea, which I thought too, that she came to a special center for people like her house. It's sort of a halfway house for people who are in psychiatric treatment and who can't live in their own flats. They were very nice, and they had a good feeling for Luise, and they could see that she certainly did not get better from the medication. But unfortunately, the psychiatrist could see she got much better from the medication all the time, and they kept on giving her more and more. I have forgotten to say, from day one where Luise started medication, actually she vomited. She could not, I mean, her body would not take this medication. It was from day one, and everybody was very mad at her because they could see also in sometimes she did it on purpose. I said, well, it's hard to vomit on purpose when you're in deep sleep and then suddenly wake up by vomiting. But then she had periods where she vomited all the time, which meant that actually, and it could go on for a month. I mean, just she had a sip of water, it came up immediately, which also meant, of course, in these periods she didn't get any medication because everything, I mean, and she could actually lose 20 kilos in such a month. And this I talked a lot to the psychiatrist about, and it's written all over in the file that we must do something about it because she's vomiting all the time, and she was to all different kind of, I mean, examinations with, I don't know, things down in her, I mean, seeing if she had an ulcer or things like that, which of course she did have, but I mean, she didn't have that before she started medication. At that time, she was home in the weekends, and I could actually sleep in her place. And then I could see in the nights, it's like suddenly, sometimes she fainted or in her sleep, she stopped breathing, and sometimes she was falling, and which made me very worried. And sometimes I didn't sleep at all during the night because I think I have to listen, because maybe she suddenly collapsed in her sleep and doesn't wake up. And I started also talking to a psychiatrist about it, and he said, well, she just does it on purpose. I mean, it's like they have 5 different explanations on what happens. One is to get attention. That was the same I heard the first time when she collapsed in Rigshospital. It was just to get attention. The other is, well, you don't know how ill she is. She doesn't know herself. They think they get worse from the medication. That's also a part of their disease. They can't see how much they need it. of course, they couldn't really say that it was part of her disease, that I could see she get worse from the medication. But then they said I was sort of not supporting them. I mean, and that was not good for Luise. That was really bad for my daughter, that I didn't support the treatment. I mean, that could make her worse. So I was actually somehow also a part in that she got worse because of my non-cooperative attitude. What shocked me so much was to read the files, because it's like what the psychiatrist wrote in the file was not at all what, it wasn't true at all. I don't know why they do it. There was 2 incidents where I directly read the file of a conversation just after the conversation has taken place, and what they wrote was not at all what happened. I mean, she was very clever. She knew all about what day it was and what month it was, and she was very good at speaking out for herself for the first time in her life, actually. But he wanted to write that in a file so he could justify that he put her up in medication, and that he obviously, which he did, admitted her to a psychiatric ward shortly after. Yeah. Yeah, that was so horrible too. I mean, I talked to Luise every day. I visited her every day when she was in a psychiatric ward, which she was at that time when she died. And then the last day, she didn't want me visiting her. And I was very curious why that happened, because it never happened. She always wanted me to come. But anyway, I said, well, I'll go tomorrow, so I'll see what's that all about. The next morning, 7:30, the phone called. Luise always called, but she didn't call 7:30 because the phone wasn't even open at that time. And then in the phone was a voice saying a lot of, sorry to say, a lot of crap about people who had been running up and down the halls in the hospital, and I just remember saying, just tell me what's happened. Is she dead? Yeah, she was dead. And oh, that was horrible. Yeah. It did mean a lot for me to write the book. It was on 2 levels. One of them is like I talk to Luise all the time, which I love. That's why I have to read it again and again too. It's like I'm with her. But maybe when I look back, maybe what was very important too was that it did sort of make some order in my head of what has happened. And maybe also, it sounds strange, but also I found out, well, I did what I could do. I mean, at the beginning, I was actually screaming on my own every time I read it, because it was so horrible to read. But at last, you know, it's like, well, I had been through it so often, so it was therapeutic, yes. I mean, I suddenly realized, like, a strange comparison, but it's like, I mean, if you hate going to a funeral, if you go often enough, then it doesn't take all, I mean, it gets easier. I mean, it never gets easy to lose a person, but I mean, it was like it took breath out of me. I mean, reading the files and, but also remembering what happened. I mean, reading the file and remember what really happened. And then my poor Luise, who, she was tortured. I mean, how often wasn't she in bed and given medication by force? I mean, how often wasn't she? The situation was that she was in bed and they wanted to give her an injection. And they have wanted that many days, and she had fought every day. But today she's not fighting so much, but she's crying a little and wants to hold hand with a psychiatrist. Oof, how can he write it? He was the one who was giving the injection. And he obviously thinks it's okay and write it. I mean, is it? I don't know, like the Stockholm syndrome. I mean, you start loving the person who tortures. I don't know what. No, she was just dead scared. she knew what it was. I mean, getting an injection. I mean, she had actually had injection which made her almost die. So she knew what it was about. She knew all about what it was about. That's why she was fighting. And they also wrote in the file, and she said she has had so much medicine that she almost died from it, which was true. But that was a kind, in their opinion, a way, that she didn't realize how ill she was. I went to the whole trial, and of course, every argument was rejected, and even those things they can sort of judge a psychiatrist for is not right in the file or right. But actually, there was nothing written in the file the last week. The week where Luise was having this new medication, where she was having the injection, which made her die after 10 hours, nothing was written at all. We called him per phone, and he said in the phone, "Of course I have informed consent." And we have to believe this. But why? He was supposed to write it in the file. There was nothing written at all. Seroquel 400 milligram. She had just come down from 600, so she still had 600 in her body, because it was just a day before. Yeah, and 6 milligrams Risperdal. Yeah, and 200 milligrams Troxal, which was PN medication, but I can see in the file she had it that day. And 6 milligrams ORAP or 8 milligram, I've forgotten. She just came down from 12 anyway. So that was the 4 sort of antipsychotics. Then she was on Rivotril, clonazepam, 2 or 4 milligrams. Well, daily doses was 2 milligrams, but she had a lot of extra. She was an oxazepam, I think it's called. Yeah, 2 different sort of sedatives. Yeah. Of course, she had medication for the side effects. Yeah, which is in many ways the same as a medication for psychosis anyway. But anyway, she had that medication for side effects. Quite a high doses too. And then the last day, when she died 10 hours later, was injection Risperdal. Yeah. And I have told the psychiatrist, don't ever give her medication on injections. I have seen her collapsing so many times from it, and I know nobody knows at all how much medication she has in her body, because she vomits all the time. And if she gets injection, she can't vomit. And that will be her death. He promised that would go a very long time, and he would talk very closely to me about it and things like that. He didn't. I am sure the psychiatrists don't like us at all. They try to hush us actually to death. That is the very best way of, killing an organization is never to mention it. Lots of people know about us, I would say, and we have lots of people talking. Yeah, actually yesterday I had one from Norway also say she wanted to be a member of the organization that heard about us. So lots of people have heard about us, and lots of people can use us. But they say that it does help to talk to people who know what it's all about, instead of talking to an organization which doesn't know what it's about. It's so comforting. We can't help, we can't move icebergs anyway. Yeah, but we go to a lot of conferences, and we always try to also have the chance to say, I come from that and psychiatric care, and I know I am of this and that opinion. So our name is mentioned very often. Unfortunately, yeah, many people die, not every day, almost maybe, and some of them contact us. Lots of people don't. I mean, they get so shocked after what has happened, so they just want to turn their back. And that is different ways of treating your sorrow or your grief.
Nu skal vi se. Jeg har ikke sådan, jeg vil lige have. Du havde nogle idéer, og jeg tænkte bare, at jeg kører fra mit hoved lidt.
Ja, det vil jeg også helst have, faktisk.
Ja.
Men jeg kan da se, Paul, han er jo, du ved, jævnligt kommer han jo lige med et lille input, det er jo så længere. Men der skrev han også et eller andet sted, kapitel 21 og 22, men det er der, hvor Luise kommer over første gang på Rigshospitalet.